And joining our discussion now, Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff of California. He is the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. And Congressman Schiff, the House of Representatives did almost exactly the same thing today. They just kind of didn't want to talk about it out loud. And we showed that video of the way the House floor works that you're so familiar with. It seems like the House members were willing to allow this kind of resolution to go through. They just didn't want to get up and say very much about it.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And, you know, kudos to Steve Cohen for introducing the resolution. But this was, in terms of the floor procedure, the closest thing to a legislative whisper. This was the majority deciding, OK, we're going to pass this, but please, nobody tell the White House that we did this. That was the legislative equivalent of what we saw today.
And what were you hearing from House members about this and about the president's rhetoric? I just asked Senator Reid if he detected that any of the Republican senators that were in any way afraid of voting for what was essentially a rebuke of the president. It seems like, as we see in the style of it, the House members didn't want to attract attention to it. But if some of them wanted to be on record as not supporting it, they could have had a roll call vote and voted against it.
They could have. You know, I don't think they were prepared to go that far. A lot of them want to try to have their cake and eat it, too. They want to be able to say, hey, I support a resolution in favor of NATO, but they don't want to say it too loudly lest the president hears. You know, this has unfortunately been the history of the last year and a half, which is almost complete capitulation by the GOP, certainly in the House and by most in the Senate as well. And this comes, I think, as one of the most painful realizations of the Trump administration, and that is not what a terrible President Donald Trump would turn out to be, which was all too predictable, but how complicit the GOP would be, how infrequently they would speak out on what ostensibly had been their core principles, or really on any principles when they conflicted with the president. And I think that has put our democracy at real risk, because in the face of repeated assaults on our democratic institutions, the Republican reaction has been largely to either run away or remain mute.
And, Congressman, I want to get your reaction to what the president had to say publicly, what we know he has said publicly, including his attack on a NATO member, Germany, saying that they basically were completely dominated and under the control of Russia.
Well, you know what it reminded me of, frankly, is that debate exchange with Hillary Clinton, where Hillary Clinton said, voters don't want a puppet for Vladimir Putin, and Trump's reaction was, you're the puppet. I know you are, but what am I? Kind of grade school response. And we see that here with him attacking Merkel and Germany for basically bowing before Russia, when if there's any leader around the globe that has bowed before Putin, it's Donald Trump. But this is very much the kind of Trumpian strategy, which is whatever is accused of you, you level that accusation against others. The other thing that leapt out at me about the president's participation and comments at NATO is his pushing the idea of not a 2% contribution of defense spending, but doubling it to 4%, basically signaling to our NATO allies that he is not going to be satisfied with anything they do. In fact, he doesn't want to be satisfied. He wants a fight with NATO. That's just where he's coming from. And it's singularly destructive to our collective security for all the reasons that Jack Reed pointed out.
And, Congressman, after you've spent so much time studying the Trump campaign's relationship and interactions with Russia and Russians, we see the president on his way, in effect, now to a meeting with Vladimir Putin, a summit with him. And we are told there will be a one-on-one meeting where it will simply be Putin, Trump, and the translators. Do you have concerns about that?
I certainly do. And I think there's clearly a reason why the president wants to meet alone with Putin, and that is he wants to be able to leave that meeting and be able to make any claim, no matter how at odds with the facts about what took place, knowing that Putin will not challenge him on it, knowing that he can represent whatever is in his interests, even though he isn't going to be willing to confront Putin on our elections. He's not going to be willing to confront Putin on Russia's invasion of its neighbor or the support of a war criminal in Syria. But Trump can claim whatever he wants. That is certainly dangerous, I think, to our interests. We don't know what representations he will make to Putin, what understanding they may arrive at that they keep secret. but it is very much in Russia's interest. And I can only say, and much as I appreciate the kind of lukewarm gesture that we saw out of the House and Senate on NATO, Republicans need to speak out. I'm reminded of the title of Churchill's book, While England Slept. The GOP is sleeping right now as we see authoritarianism rise around the world, and they need to wake up because both parties in America need to confront this challenge.
And Congressman Schiff, before you go, I just want to get any comment you might have, if any, about your colleague, Republican Congressman Jim Jordan's reaction to the reports of wrestlers that he used to be the coach of, what they are saying about what transpired on that team and what they're saying about your colleague, Congressman Jordan.
Well, I clearly don't know anything about the facts there, so I don't want to wade into it. Obviously, it's a serious allegation, but in terms of whether there's merit to the allegation, I'm really not in a position to say.
Congressman Adam Schiff, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.